Welcome back. Today I want to talk about Fatima AL-Fihri, but also about something bigger, the difficulties historians face when trying to reconstruct women's history. Fatima AL-Fihri is often presented as the founder of the Karayin Mosque in Fez in the 9th century. In many modern accounts, she's also described as the founder of the world's first university. It's an attractive story. It gives us a named woman, a major institution, and a legacy that still matters today. But that's exactly why we have to be careful. A story that's powerful and widely repeated can start to feel certain, even when the evidence behind it is limited. Fatima's case is useful because it shows us how easily historical memory, later tradition, and modern interpretation can blend together to produce something of undoubtable value, but questionable accuracy. So what can we say with confidence about Fatima? Well, surprisingly little. The safest basic statement is that Fatima AL-Fihri is associated with the founding of the Karayin Mosque, usually dated to around 857 to 859 CE. Many accounts also say that she used inherited wealth to support the construction. That's the core of the story. Once we move beyond that, the record becomes much less clear. The main written accounts about Fatima come from sources that were produced centuries after her lifetime. One of the most cited sources, and the earliest known, Ibn Abi Zar, was writing in the 14th century, roughly 400 years after Fatima lived. And that gap matters a great deal. You might well ask, how did the story of Fatima's life reach Ibn Abi Zar? And the simple answer is, we don't know. He doesn't seem to be drawing on a direct 9th century record of her life. More likely, he was repeating a version of her story that had already become part of Fez's local historical memory, probably through scholarly tradition, institutional memory at Karayin, and possibly earlier sources that have since been lost. That means his account may preserve an older tradition, but it still comes to us at a very long distance from the events it describes. Over that length of time, stories are inevitably going to be shaped by memory, by retelling, with each teller changing the story, even very slightly, and by the concerns of later periods. If a source is written 400 years after the event it describes, it may preserve an older memory, but it may also reflect later assumptions or priorities, or later efforts to give the institution, in this case, a more polished origin story. So when historians ask about Fatima's life, who she was, what she did, they aren't just asking whether a woman named Fatima existed, they're asking what kind of evidence supports the claims made about her, and how much of the familiar story is original and how much was later added. Now, one of the biggest problems in answering those questions is that the surviving sources are rarely neutral. Chronicles, local histories, institutional narratives, later biographical summaries, all often had reasons to present the past in a particular way. They might want to glorify a city, legitimize a mosque or a school, celebrate a patron, or connect an institution to a respected lineage. In those contexts, a woman could still be included, but often in a highly selective form. That means we may not be seeing women as they actually lived, we may be seeing women as later writers wanted them to appear. This is one reason why historians are cautious about treating a repeated story as proof. Repetition is not the same as documentation. A tale can be told often enough that it starts to sound like settled fact, even if the evidence is thin. Fatima's case is a good example also of how founder stories work. Modern summaries say she founded a university, but this compresses a long historical process into one neat event. The Karayin began as a mosque. Over time, it became a major center of learning. That later development is important, but it's not the same thing as saying it was designed as a university in the modern sense from the beginning. This distinction matters because institutions often create origin stories that are simpler than the real history. Later generations like clear beginnings. They like to point to one person, one date, one act and say, this is where it all started. But real institutional history is usually messier and includes gradual development, multiple patrons, evolving uses. So when we hear that Fatima founded a university, the question isn't just whether that's true, the question is whether the language of university is being used carefully, or whether a later concept has been projected backwards onto the 19th century. Fatima's case is interesting, but it isn't unusual. Her example reflects a broader problem in women's history. Women are often less visible in surviving record. Simply put, women's history is harder to reconstruct than men's, and there are several reasons for this. First, women were less likely than men to leave behind texts that were copied and preserved. Even when women were active in public life, their actions weren't always written down in the same way as men's actions. The role of women is essentially under-recorded in historical archives. Second, the institutions that preserved records were often male-dominated. That shaped what was considered worth keeping. A text that supported a scholarly lineage, a family reputation, or a religious institution was more likely to survive than one that centered a woman's role in a less conventional way. So archives are selective. What survives in them is a result of what, usually male, scholars decided was worth keeping. And third, when women do appear in records, they're often described relationally, as daughters, wives, mothers, or relatives of important men. Their actions are often described in limited terms: piety, charity, family duty, rather than as economic or institutional agency. That doesn't mean they had no agency. It means the record often filters that agency through family or reputation. So historians don't just face missing evidence, they face an archive of evidence that is already skewed. And that's a crucial point. The problem is not only that women are absent, it's that the systems that generated and preserved historical evidence were shaped in ways that made women's actions harder to record clearly in the first place. These aren't random problems. They come from how historical records were created and preserved in the first place. Because of these conditions, women's histories often reach us through long chains of transmission, often arriving in a very compressed form. At each stage, from event to memory to written account to modern retelling, something can change. Details can get lost or added. Motives can get simplified or distorted. Gaps get filled with plausible assumptions or convenient fictions. A long process involving several people can be reduced to a single name. A network of patronage can be turned into one founding figure. A gradual institutional development can be turned into one dramatic act. That simplification can be useful. It helps people remember the past. It creates a clear narrative. But in removing complexity, we distort reality. In Fatima's case, we may be seeing exactly this process. A real act of patronage, funding, or supporting a mosque can, over time, become a more defined and expanded story. A single woman founding a major institution with a clear and lasting identity. Later retellings may have sharpened a messier and more nuanced series of events into a cleaner, more memorable founding myth. That doesn't make the story false as such, and it doesn't make it meaningless. But it does mean that it has likely changed shape over time, and we have to separate what is well supported from what has been built up later. This is one of the hardest things in women's history. The stories we have are often not pure inventions, but neither are they transparent records. They're layered. They preserve something real, but in altered form. At this point, it's useful to distinguish between two different kinds of loss, because erasure and distortion are not the same thing. Sometimes women's history is actively erased. That means deliberate suppression, names removed, monuments altered, memory attacked. In those cases, the goal is to make someone disappear from the record. Other times, women are not so much erased as distorted. Their actions survive, but they're reframed, simplified, or absorbed into bigger narratives. Fatima's case seems closer to distortion than direct erasure. There's no clear sign of a campaign to delete her. Instead, the problem is that the surviving account comes through late and selective sources, and the story has been shaped by later retelling. That difference matters. It helps historians avoid assigning intentional suppression when archival neglect or narrative simplification may be enough to explain the distortion. There's also the issue of physical evidence, such as inscriptions or building remains. In principle, material evidence can be very valuable because it seems more direct than later storytelling. But even material evidence can be hard to interpret. Inscriptions can be covered, moved, reused, damaged, or recontextualized. Buildings change over time. Renovations can obscure original features. Later generations may read new meanings into old objects. So when a trace of Fatima appears in the material record, historians still have to ask what that trace actually tells us. Does it confirm a founding act? Does it preserve a later memory? Does it show continuous visibility or only a rediscovered fragment of the past? That kind of caution isn't nitpicking, it's part of what careful historical method looks like. A comparison with Hatshepsut helps clarify the issue. Hatshepsut is one of the clearest examples of active historical suppression. In her case, there is evidence of names and images being removed or altered. That is a visible kind of erasure. It tells us that later rulers were trying to reshape memory deliberately. Fatima's case is different. The evidence doesn't point to a similar campaign of destruction. Her story seems to have survived, but in a form shaped by distance, institutional memory, and much later interpretation. It's a useful contrast because it shows that women's historical visibility can be damaged in more than one way. Sometimes the record is attacked, sometimes it simply decays, narrows, or becomes more symbolic over time. Historians have to ask what kind of loss they're looking at. Hypatia of Alexandria offers another useful comparison, and one with a different lesson. Unlike Fatima, Hypatia is documented by much nearer sources. We have references from late antique writers, letters from students, and accounts of her death. That gives historians a stronger evidentiary base. But even with that stronger base, you'll remember from our episode on Hypatia that her story has been repeatedly reshaped. In some later traditions, Hypatia became a martyr for reason. In others, she was turned into a symbol of feminine virtue, tragedy, or intellectual purity. In modern writing, she's often used as an emblem of women in science or as a stand-in for broader conflicts between religion and philosophy. These aren't random distortions. They show how later generations use historical women for their own purposes. A figure like Hypatia becomes a vessel for ideas that go far beyond what the original sources can prove. That's why Hypatia is relevant here. She shows that even when evidence is relatively strong, women's history can still be reimagined to fit later cultural needs. In Fatima's case, where the evidence is thinner and later, the pressure to simplify the story is even stronger. So the comparison helps in two ways. First, it shows that reinterpretation is a general historical process. Second, it reminds us that weak evidence doesn't mean the story is false, but it does mean the story is more vulnerable to later reshaping. Now, at this point, I feel I should probably take a slight digression and talk to those of you who might be asking yourself, yes, but when is it Men's History Month or something similar? So let me be clear. Yes, distortion happens to men too. For well-documented figures, kings, generals, philosophers, and so on, the record is often dense, but still slanted. Chronicles highlight battles and political events, downplaying personal or social life. Later generations simplify complex rulers into neat good kings, bad kings types. Propaganda, hagiography, and later retellings polish or exaggerate their actions. In that sense, the process of distortion is similar. Historians still have to ask how much is fact, how much is later interpretation, and how much is narrative inconvenience. But women's cases are different, and the key difference is volume and structure of the records. As we've already seen, archives are skewed towards male-coded roles. Soldiers, officials, scholars, landowners. So men's actions generate more traces, even when particular aspects are distorted. Because women appear far less often in the surviving material, each time they do appear, their stories are more vulnerable to being simplified into a single exemplary figure, or reframed as pious or charitable rather than politically, economically active, or compressed into a single founding myth like Fatima's university story. So men's histories get distorted, but they are less likely to be structurally erased. Women's histories are distorted and often underdocumented, so that the compression hits harder and the gaps are harder to fix. Men's histories are distorted, but the distortion usually sits on top of a relatively solid base of evidence. Women's histories are often distorted on top of a very thin base. So the same kind of simplification can have a much larger effect on what later generations can know. Okay? Back to the show. So this brings us to a basic question. How should historians speak when the evidence is incomplete? They usually don't think in terms of yes or no terms. Instead, they work with degrees of confidence. They may ask, is there a consistent tradition linking this person to the event? How late are the sources? What kind of genre are those sources? What do the sources actually claim and what are later readers adding? Does the material record confirm the story? Does it complicate it? Or is it just ambiguous? That's the right kind of questioning for Fatima's case. It allows historians to avoid two opposite mistakes. The first mistake is treating the later narrative as if it were straightforward fact. The second is dismissing the story entirely because the evidence is imperfect. Neither approach is good history. The first is too confident, the second is too crude. A better approach is to say the tradition is historically meaningful, but its precise contours are uncertain. Fatima AL-Fihri continues to matter because her story carries real symbolic weight. Fatima's story is often used today to highlight women's contributions to education and intellectual life. She's often invoked in discussions of women's patronage, women's education, and women's roles in Islamic history. That's a valuable goal. That makes her valuable in modern debate. Her story can challenge the assumption that women were absent from major institutional life. But it can also create pressure to treat a meaningful story as if it were fully documented fact. And so historians have to balance two things: recognizing that women's contributions were real and important, while also being honest about the limits of the evidence. Her symbolic value can create pressure to overstate the evidence. A story that's inspiring is not automatically fully documented. Historians have to resist the temptation to turn resonance into proof. At the same time, they also have to avoid the opposite error, assuming that uncertainty means insignificance. Even if the exact shape of Fatima's role can't be reconstructed in detail, the fact that her name survives at all is meaningful. It tells us something about how women could be remembered, about how institutions shaped memory, and about how historical traditions can preserve women, albeit in partial, altered form. There's also an ethical question here. When a woman appears only faintly in the record, it can feel uncomfortable to emphasize uncertainty. People may worry that caution is a way of diminishing her. Careful historical work is not the same as skepticism for its own sake. The goal isn't to strip women of significance. The goal is to attribute agency accurately. That means saying what the evidence supports, where it's thin, and where later tradition has probably done some of the work. It also means recognizing that a woman can be historically real and still be narrated in a way that simplifies her life. That balance feels especially important in women's history because women have often been either over-sanitized into symbols or pushed aside as marginal. The challenge is to keep them visible without making them into myths. So what does Fatima's example teach us? Well, if I can be poetic for a moment, Fatima AL-Fihri's story sits at this intersection of history and tradition. What I mean by that is that on one hand she's connected to the early history of Karayin and to a real pattern of women's patronage. On the other hand, the details of her life come to us through late sources, selective memory, and later reinterpretation. That makes her a useful case study, not because she's impossible to know, but because she's only ever going to be partially knowable. And that's the deeper lesson. Women's history is difficult to reconstruct, not just because the records are missing, but because the records that do survive were shaped by institutions, assumptions, and by later needs that often worked against the clear recognition of women's roles. So the best historical stance is a careful one, not the extremes of dismissal or credulity, careful attribution. Fatima AL-Fihri may be more historically real than some skeptics allow and more narratively shaped than some celebrants assume. Both things can be true at once. That is exactly why Fatima and her story matters. Next time we journey to Japan to look at the life of Murasaki, a Japanese noblewoman and lady-in-waiting who wrote the tale of Genji, the world's first novel. But until then, I hope you enjoyed this one. It's been a bit different from the others so far, but it seemed like a good opportunity to explore some of the issues surrounding women's history, which I'd sort of known about before, but didn't really appreciate until doing the research for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please do leave a comment with your thoughts. But anyway, thank you for joining me. Please feed the algorithm by liking, sharing, and subscribing on your way out. And until next time, whatever you're up to, have a great day.